my fear is if we buy into that hype, if we're going to be pushed to play the algorithmic game, we're going to lose because the machines are better than us at that.
Welcome to the CHATROG podcast, where we explore the ethics of artificial intelligence with those shaping our digital future. I'm Roger Steare, the corporate philosopher, and today I'm honored to be joined by Professor David Weitzner, a management scholar at York University in Canada, and author of Thinking Like a Human, The Power of Your Mind in the Age of AI. He also writes the Managing with Meaning blog for Psychology Today. David's work explores the intersection of morality, leadership, and meaningful change in the modern workplace. Drawing on both academic research and real-world experience, he challenges us to rethink what it means to lead responsibly in turbulent times. Get ready for an enlightening conversation with David.
Thanks, Roger.
Well, you're very welcome. David, let's get right in. What does it mean to think like a human in the age of AI, and what are we in danger of forgetting?
I think what's most important, as I outline in the book, is understanding that there are different types of intelligences. There's algorithmic thinking, which humans engage in sometimes, but which is the type of thinking that our AIs and our technology uses. It follows an algorithm. And algorithmic thinking is powerful. Following rules is powerful. Step-by-step analysis is powerful, but it's not the only way to think. We also use our bodies to think. In the book, I talk about beam thinking. We use our physical bodies. We use the natural environment. We think through action. And in fact, our thinking is born of a very holistic conception of the mind rather than just all in the brain. And that's what I worry we're going to lose in the age of AI, because every time one of the executives at big tech gets a platform and starts talking about how AI is smarter than us, better than us, more competent than any of us, what they're saying is it can process certain algorithms, calculate certain ends better than we can. And that it can do. But that's not the essence of thinking. And my fear is if we buy into that hype, then we'll forget that our strength is in natural intelligence. In other words, if we're going to be pushed to play the algorithmic game, we're going to lose because the machines are better than us at that. But if we remember that thinking like a human involves embodied cognition, social relationships, ethics, emotions, etc., then we're not at threat. And then we can use the tools in a way that makes sense to us as embodied beings, rather than let the tools control us and drive the new norms.
Thank you. You draw a distinction between algorithmic intelligence and artful intelligence, which I think you've just described. Could you unpack that a bit more for us and why you think that matters?
Yeah. So artful thinking doesn't necessarily just mean creative art, like in the classical art sense, like painting, drawing. Artful thinkers are in medicine. You know, when you look at the really great doctors in the field, they'll tell you that sometimes they make a diagnosis based on gut. Sometimes they'll say the key relationship that's so important to them is the patient-doctor relationship, because turning on that empathy, that caring, that being present, that's what's so important. And that's artful thinking. They recognize that the art of medicine that goes beyond the science of prescriptions and certain diagnoses is equally important. There's an artfulness in engineering. There's an artfulness in business and law. Every field can approach their problem solving through an artful approach. And the way I outline the artful approach in the book, as I just said before, is this idea of beam thinking, right? Embodied, environment, action, mind, as opposed to algorithmic. Algorithmic says the only thing that matters is following the sequence of steps. So let's stick with the doctor example, right? Those advocates who say that AI will replace all doctors are presuming that the key trait or the key strength of a doctor is their ability to diagnose based on following a certain pattern. So if I see symptom A, B, and C, that means the disease is E, right? And if I don't see those symptoms, then it's not that. And if it's simply that calculus, then again, yes, the algorithm, the computer, the AI will be better at that. It's not better yet, by the way, because AI still hallucinates and is errors and is unreliable. So let's park the fact that it's not good at that yet. But let's assume one day it will be good at that. I still would rather have in that environment a human doctor who also employs empathy, care, tuition, human-to-human contact, using the AI as a tool, of course, because there is utility in following the algorithm. There is utility in saying, I forgot briefly that those three symptoms can lead to diagnosis E, you know? So use it as a tool, certainly, but it won't replace us. And if you listen to those at the frontier of tech, really some of the leaders even in the field, they truly say things like, it's silly to train radiologists. Within 5 years, they'll be useless. There'll be no place for them. And I don't agree with that. However, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough folks are scared and start buying into the hype that their skills aren't useful, that their artful approaches aren't as valued as this optimal type of algorithmic approach, then they'll stop training themselves. It's something we're seeing a lot of in the business world right now, is companies who start to embrace AI, even though, again, the tool isn't great yet, they say, no, I'm going to bring it in because it can do the work of 3 juniors. And suddenly the job of juniors disappear. And suddenly you're not training the next generation. And then in 5 or 10 years from now, when you realize, ooh, that AI isn't all it's cracked up to be, who's there to step up?
Thank you, David. That's really clear. You challenge the philosophy of cold, rational calculus in ethical decision-making. This has no place in any of the world's religious traditions, which instead focus on compassion and need. I mean, clearly there's an analogy there with the doctor who cares about their patient. In fact, it has been argued, as you know, and you mentioned utility, that the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the root cause of many of the existential crises we face, from the persecution of minorities to environmental catastrophe. In your view, is there any place for cold rational logic and algorithm in moral reasoning?
Any place? Sure. Right? I'll never close the door on anyone who comes with good intentions and wants to use a tool that may help them become better at ethical thinking. Primary place? Absolutely not. As you mentioned, even in the religious traditions that may be more rule-based, it's the soul, it's the heart that has to come first. And if we move to a model that's pure calculation and we remove the heart, we remove the soul, it's not ethical anymore. You might have met a threshold. You might be following a rule. You might think you're doing right. Your intentions might be good. But I think the realm of ethics is that space where we welcome uncertainty, where we welcome subjectiveness, emotion, and human to human. And something that I push really hard in my own work as an ethics prof is the idea that, when you think about ethics, too often average folks or students think that ethics means following the law. So if I'm following the law, if I'm meeting, what's required of me legally, I'm being ethical. And they're not right. The law may set the minimal floor for ethics. In other words, if you're not doing this, you're definitely not ethical. But to think that a series of rules is sufficient to meet your ethical obligation, rather than wrestling with the human-to-human condition, you're missing the point. And, it's difficult as a prof to say that, because the students would rather I come in and say, hey, I'm going to teach you the 5 rules. You follow these rules, you're ethical. Boom, right? And I don't say that. I say, no, as you face each human, as you face each moral challenge, you got to wrestle in real time with that situation. And that's hard.
Absolutely. I get that. I get the same reaction with business leaders who really don't want to spend the effort thinking and wrestling with these dilemmas, as you say.
Right.
So do you think that there's a danger that as AI and algorithms are programmed to feel more human, so we already know that there are chatbots that you can get as a friend who are constantly allegedly empathetic. Do you think that there's a danger there that people will think that they're being helped with making a difficult moral decision because this thing is programmed to be kind or use kind words and always be there for you?
Yeah, there's nothing more dangerous than that. People forget that AI isn't empathetic. It isn't kind. It isn't smart. It's an algorithm. And the specific algorithm, it's programmed to generate next letter hypotheses, right? It's trying to guess what the next letter should be. So it has no conception of love or kindness or empathy. And it's scary to me that the industry willfully programs it to mislead. It's not an accident that they're using the language of empathy. They know it's not empathetic, but they want folks to be drawn in. And one of the scariest things I've read recently is that the chatbots designed as romantic partners and friends are the worst for security. In other words, those are the ones really designed to glean personal information and use it against you. They want you to share more of your heart so that someone on the other end can profit off that and take advantage of you. And it's so sad because it comes back to what we just spoke about, right? Why do these chatbots exist? because there's a real need in the marketplace. There's a real need in our society to fill the loneliness gap. But for our leaders to wrestle with the fact that we have human beings here who are multifaceted and have emotional needs, and these emotional needs are complex, and meeting your moral obligation for these humans is complex. And so instead of thinking, how do we as a society support our more vulnerable members, which is difficult, it's a lot easier to say, ooh, here's a subscription to ChatGPT. Go get yourself a virtual friend. You know, one of the CEOs, I forget who, when they were doing massive layoffs, said that I hope you turn to our chatbot for counseling after we lay you off, which was just, such a heartless comment, because you also know that you're not even getting good counseling if that's the source of it. And so part of my book is to give people hope, to know that beam thinking is empowering and that we can think like a human and we can, get all these hopefully new directions going. But the other point of the book is to unpack AI, because I think a lot of folks are a little bit ignorant of what this technology is and isn't. And, if you're using it to help arrange a slideshow presentation, wonderful. But if you're using it as a substitute for human connection, you're using it for love or emotional support, that's not good.
I mean, this is chilling. And one of the things that you explain in your book, you use the case of the hospital algorithm case in your book, which is obviously chilling. Is this where rationality can become inhuman?
100%. That example really shows the calculus, right? If your primary goal in giving care is to minimize cost, then it makes a lot of sense, like this algorithm does, to diagnose those who are most likely to benefit the least from the care and create a rationale to move them out of the care box and into the hospice model, into the end of life model, because this way you're saving money, your stats go up. Like, look, less people are dying in my hospital. Why are less people dying in my hospital? Because the dying people, I move out of my hospital. Okay, but we don't say that. The stats says there's less death here. The cost of care goes down because the more serious cases are moved out. And that's rational. That's instrumental, right? It makes sense, but it's not ethical. And in my mind, it's not the business that healthcare providers should be in. So I am a business prophet. I'm very pro-business. Should doctors make money? Absolutely. Should hospitals make money? Absolutely. But you should be making money because you're giving the best care possible. Your competitive advantage should be that you're the best at delivering care, not be making money by finding ways to shortcut care or to justify denying care to individuals.
One of the things you've made me think about is assisted dying, and how AI might actually help, and I use help in the wrong way, but assist people who are vulnerable and not able to make the right decision on that because of the commercial imperative of moving them from hospital into hospice care. And one of the challenges we've got is that tech companies are way ahead of the law. I mean, we talk about rational decision making, but every legal jurisdiction is way behind where the tech companies are taking all this. So how do we stop this? How do we keep humans in the loop? Not just technically, but morally, spiritually, and of course, legally, when it comes to protecting vulnerable people?
Yeah. This is the toughest question. I don't have a good answer for you on this one because I'm in Canada. And in Canada, our assisted dying regime has gone out of control. I mean, there's memes on the internet, jokes that say, if you go to a doctor in the States and you need stitches, that'll be $35,000. If you go to a doctor in the UK and you need stitches, they say, come back in 8 months and we'll be able to do it. If you come to Canada, they say, hey, have you considered killing yourself? And it's a dark humor, but it's based on truth that since our MAID legislation has passed, they've been expanding those who qualify to include those who don't have the intellectual capacity to make the decision, to include those who will not be at risk of imminent death. And so why? Again, because of an instrumental calculus. Our government is struggling with its socialized healthcare. And so rather than think of an innovative way to expand care, they want to get as many people out of the care receiving model as possible. I have family members who are senior doctors who started off as huge advocates for assisted dying because, again, there are a category of people that need it, that it makes a lot of sense. But when it becomes a tool that's used to save money or to, fill a gap of a system that needs to care, then you've dropped off the bottom. And the reason I share this is because This is human to human decision making. Like, I can't blame the Canadian government for using AI to come to this decision around me. These are humans making the decision. They're humans with a very skewed moral sense. And so, when I wrestle with these questions, I start to get a little hopeless because the American model doesn't work. The UK model doesn't work. The Canadian model doesn't work. No one's got it right. So I think, Roger, you're asking the Nobel Prize question. If we can figure out how to get folks to be human when it comes to medical care and end of life decisions and how to find that balance, I don't know. All I can do is remind the decision makers that when they make decisions like this, they're stepping out of their human realm. They're stepping out of the ethical realm. And maybe that'll matter. To many, it doesn't, but maybe to some, it will. And it's the general difficulty of what we do professionally. In my book, I'm talking to someone about this question. And I said, when will they open their hearts? When will they come to us? And the person I was talking to, their answer was, usually when it's tragedy, usually when it's at their lowest. That's when they suddenly open their minds to it. And I can't tell you how many people who I love and respect, dear friends, who read my book and their feedback was, David, I love your suggestions about opening your heart, human to human ethics. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to change my way. It's wonderful. I think you're right. I think your arguments make sense, but you're asking too much. It's a lot easier for me as a business person to continue to make my half-hearted decisions, to continue to profit, than it is to radically change. And these are people close to me. I'm not going to say they're bad people because they're not. They're good folks. Obviously, we have not yet found the language to bring them in, to think more seriously about this. And it's an ongoing task. And, the initial hope of AI is that it would help us get there, right? For the reasons you said, because it can be useful as a database. It can offer information, data, research, arguments succinctly that individuals can unpack at their own time. But the technology has to be trustworthy. The individuals behind the programming have to be trustworthy, and humans have to help guide the process. And that's expensive and time consuming. And a lot of folks jump to AI because it's cheap, fast, and easy. So, yeah. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear your thoughts on actually that question, Roger. Do you have a direction for us?
I think I would go to the golden rule in all of these things. I think it's very easy to be abstract and hypothetical about situations. But when I talk to leaders in business or healthcare or whatever it is, I say, okay, let's not make it abstract. It's your daughter or your father in this situation. How would you want the right decision to be made? Who would make it? Who would they consult? And so on and so forth. So I think it's using some of the ancient techniques that we devised thousands of years ago, like the golden rule, do as you would be done by, I think. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, this is why people like you and I do what we do, because it's, these are the eternal questions we've still got to find the answers. I mean, coming back to you and some of the ideas you've written very eloquently about embodied knowledge. So what can breath work and intuition teach us about decision making that a large language model can't?
Yeah, I think it's so important, as you said, to come back to these ancient traditions because there's wisdom there. And it's wisdom that's been accumulated over thousands of years. And it's deep bodily wisdom because even as we're getting smarter and even as our tools are getting better, our bodies are still our bodies. And so those truths are so important. It hit me a few days ago. I was doing an interview to promote the book on satellite radio. And the language that kept coming up was mindfulness because they're saying, oh, everything you're talking about AI is something that I just have to keep in mind when I'm using it. I have to be mindful of. And it's like, yes, precisely. But start with the classic mindfulness because if you don't pause and take a breath, then you're not operating on human time. You're operating on machine time. And that's what AI wants you to do. That's what big tech wants you to do. They want you to always be on your phone, always be typing on your screens, always be active. But your body's not built that way. And so if you're going to approach AI as a tool, you need to make sure that the tool operates on human time. So mindful breathing, mindful awareness, meditation, right? Getting into your body, being aware of your body, being aware of your body's needs is the knowledge you'll need before you can go to the screen for that algorithmic knowledge, right? Before you can ask the algorithm to give you an algorithmic truth, you have to be ready to receive it. And if you're not cognizant of your breath, if you're not cognizant of what your body's saying to you, right? Sometimes your body might be saying, now's not the time for this high stress news story or for this calculation or to make this decision. But if you don't tap into your body, you won't know that. And I assure you, the tech won't remind you to do that. There is tech that tries to do that. That's separate. I, by the way, don't love that tech either. I don't love the way a lot of it has been gamified. I don't love the fact that a lot of these mindfulness apps, right? Like, ooh, you meditated for 5 minutes. You get 1,000 bonus points today, right? So again, you're moving to the language and reality of the computer, of the screen, rather than the embodied truth that has served folks for millennia.
That's a fantastic answer. And as you were speaking it, I was thinking about the power of sleeping on it when we have decisions. I mean, we don't understand what's going on in the human mind when we sleep on a problem because we know we're not ready yet to make that decision.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Douglas Rushkoff, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. We've
Douglas
just interviewed Douglas.
Okay, so you know Douglas Rushkoff, right? So, I've interviewed him for the book as well. He's a brilliant theorist. And one of the things that he said that, I always remember is he said he was one of the first to jump all in on the possibility of the web because he got into the old message boards, which were in human time. So he said, what was great about the message board was you asked your question in Europe, right? And then someone in America who 6 hours later saw it, thought about it in their time, answered it 8 hours later. You saw it 6 hours after that, right? And so the conversation was taking place over days, mediated by this tool, which is wonderful. But that's not what we're doing today when you and I can be in different time zones, but we're still expected to text each other in real time. And it eliminates the human aspect.
Even better were the days of snail mail when we had to write a letter, put a stamp on it and post it, and we'd get a reply 2 weeks later. That's a conversation, isn't it?
Right. No. And, something that I always think about is, my philosophical hero is Richard Rorty. And I studied his work for 6 years before I saw a photo of what he looked like. Because I read the journals, I read his article, book, I didn't see a photo. And there wasn't an internet when I was studying, So, I didn't have means or access. Now it's inconceivable, right? The second somebody reaches out to you, better Google them. I better have an image. I better know, all this information about them. That's not natural, right? It's perfectly okay to know someone via their handwriting and letters. That used to be okay. That we would communicate over vast distance, over days via snail mail. And that was a perfectly acceptable relationship, unheard of today. And I'm not a Luddite. I'm not anti-tech. I'm not anti-progress. But it's okay to say some classic methods, some classic ways are valuable. And that may or may not be one of them.
So what would Richard Rorty have made of AI?
I think Richard Rorty would have had fun with AI as a pragmatist. I think Richard Rorty always pushed the idea that the ultimate ethical persona was what he called the ironist, the person who was absolutely convinced of their beliefs, absolutely convinced of the rightness of their moral, philosophy, but also always open to having their mind changed, to have some new experience, new bit of information. So I think he would have found value in AI to do that, right? As a private tool I can use to constantly challenge my belief system, whether through hallucination or accurate information, giving me challenges that make me think. I think he would have found value in that as a tool. I think he would be horrified by the lack of his style, pragmatic liberalism, being put into play by those decision makers at big tech. I think he'd be absolutely horrified by their values. The thing that people forget about Richard Rorty is that even though he was an arch liberal and by his own definition of progressive, he still believed in democracy. He still believed in national pride, and he still saw space for religion. Three things that many folks today find distasteful. Rorty wasn't embarrassed by being a proud American. Rorty wasn't embarrassed by, sometimes going to a religious tradition. He was proud of citing prophets, to use his term. And I think that that's forgotten, that as we progress and as we move our societies forward, yes, harm reduction should be paramount. That was a Rortyian ideal. Absolutely, solidarity should be paramount. That was a Rortyian ideal. But we forget that there should be space within our solidarity for folks who have more traditional belief systems, folks who might have patriotic pride, folks who might express themselves differently than us, provided it's not harmful. I'm not saying Rorty would, excuse the excesses of some of those on the other side of the political spectrum today, but he certainly would have recognized that there should be space to discuss all of them.
Thank you. Can you give an example where artful intelligence helped you make a better decision than data alone would have suggested? I know this is putting you on the spot,
It's
David.
putting me on the spot, but writing the book is the answer. Writing the book is a perfect example. If I did a data analysis of the probability of me making good money off my book, especially relative to the hours/years it took to compile the book, the algorithm would have said, don't do it. Okay? Artful Intelligence said, do it. And Artful Intelligence was right because I gained from writing the book. I believe it's better to have the book out there. I wouldn't be conversing with you if that book wasn't out there. And I've gained already from this conversation. So I think, writing the book was a decision made by Artful Intelligence, certainly not the economic algorithmic calculus, which would have told me that my time is much better spent doing almost anything else.
I love that. I love that. You coined the 5-step hustle.
Yes.
Phrase the 5-step hustle to describe big tech's AI marketing strategy.
Yes.
Is AI just the latest speculative bubble in disguise?
I think the answer right now, based on everything I know, is a clean and easy yes. The amount of money that is being sunk in to the existing architecture is astronomical. So, when I say I'm hopeful about AI, I'm hopeful about a future AI. I believe that, innovation will continue. There will be new technologies, new ways to build artificial intelligence, maybe even embodied intelligence, maybe robots, et cetera, will come to pass. What we have right now are LLMs, large language models. They are not the answer to AI. They are not reliable. Scaling them up isn't the solution. And yet there's so much money being sunk into the existing way of doing things, so little money being thrown at researchers trying to find alternative. And I worry that not only is it a bubble in the classic sense, a bubble because of economic investment, but I worry also the fact that because of what's happening in government and a move, sort of an anti-education move where our universities are being defunded, the folks who might otherwise be doing the research to discover the next technology don't have the resources to do it. And so I worry this bubble will be exasperated because of all the research is taking place now in the private sector. And the private sector is so heavily financially committed to the old model. And they're continuing to throw good money after bad. And the places that used to have the leisure to explore ideas and do the research that may not be, profitable in the near term aren't well funded. That's incredibly scary. And I'm hearing even in the private sector that's happening. I'm hearing, again, this is rumor and innuendo, so I wouldn't stake my reputation on it. But I have contacts at Google who say, the moonshot department, that department that threw money and said, just go and be and explore and do what you want and had all these breakthroughs, is now not being supported the way it once was as Google moves away from search and into AI. And as Google starts to ruin its own brilliant innovation, right? Google search was amazing 10 years ago. It was a mind-blowing tool. And as that tool has been replaced with AI, where now, they have the AI summaries. And so they never go to your site or my site. And it's terrible, just simply talking about hallucinations, right? So the other day, I Googled my own beam thinking, and Google gave an AI summary that beam thinking comes from me. So at least I get credit. And it stands for body, environment, action, and motivation. So it was wrong. It got the answer wrong. And that's the first thing you see. And according to the studies that I've seen, 7% of people, once they see an AI summary, they move on. So no one's going to click an article. No one's going to click a link. And they're just walking away now with bad information. Not good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, according to ChatGPT, I'm based in Singapore.
Okay. There you go.
There you go. So, So staying with bubbles and crashes, you draw parallels to the 2008 financial crisis. Do you see any equivalent moral hazard emerging in the AI economy today in a more holistic sense? So we've talked about, so it's not just about the impact on the economy, but the impact on society, on politics, on the environment as well.
Yes. And I think the root cause is similar, which is to say that with the financial crisis, many of the drivers were people who used the language of ethics. So they said, what's our goal? Our goal is to get more people into houses, is to increase home ownership. We're doing a social good. Just like right now, they're saying, what's the AI? It's to love you. It's to teach you. It's to care for you, right? So I think the scariest parallel is both bubbles are based on individuals in power using the language of care and ethics to justify a regime of personal enrichment that is anything but caring. And when it drops, as usual, it'll be the most vulnerable that will suffer the most. And as usual, those at the top will probably get away free. You know, there was a famous quote from Bernanke 7 years after the crisis where he said, generally, Americans don't like rewarding the arsonists after we put out the fire. But in the case of the '08 crisis, that's basically what happened. Nobody suffered who caused the problem. And I fear that's what's going to happen here. Are big tech going to disappear? No, right? They'll be on to the next hustle, right? Remember the metaverse? Remember that? What's going on with the metaverse? Nothing. Now, if I hear the news correctly, Zuckerberg's recruiting people at $100 million a pop to come join his super intelligence team. So they're still rolling in amounts of money beyond our conception. They're still creating products that may not have legs, and we will suffer. Now, that doesn't mean, again, I'm going to come back and be careful. That doesn't mean capitalism is bad. That doesn't mean business is bad, right? That doesn't mean that it couldn't be different. It could be different. It should be different. It needs to be different. But we need to put our investment dollars and our energy as consumers towards companies that have the values that align with our personal belief systems, and not just go to the default folks who may not care about us.
I love the way this is going, because what I'd like to do now is ask you about the sacred and the strange. So you write about godlike AI and AI religions. So could this be the next thing that big tech goes for? Are we on the verge of worshipping our algorithmic tools? And what does this say about us?
I have no doubt that that's the case. I have no doubt that that's what they're interested in. And it's the easiest hustle. And again, it's what makes me sad, because it comes back to what we just talked about, right? I'm a business professor, but I worry about people who use business and give it a bad name. It's the same idea here. I am a spiritual practitioner. I am a religious person. And nothing to me is more beautiful than a religious or spiritual tradition. And many folks have become skeptical and cynical because of the bad behavior of some spiritual and religious individuals. And so now they're turning to have that religious and spiritual need filled by folks who they think are more reliable. And they're not more reliable. Elon Musk, for all his virtues and vices, is not more reliable than a spiritual practitioner. He's not the person you should be going to fill that need. And I worry deeply about this, because it's so easy to play the godlike game right now. It's so easy, as people are ignorant about the technology, to see wonder there and just be overwhelmed. And awe is important. It's what my past book was about. The feeling of awe and wonder and soul are so integral to the human experience. And so I come back to the idea that it's up to us, you, me, Rushkoff, and other folks, to be advocates for spiritual language, for religious language when appropriate, for soulful language, and to remind people that, it's not an either or proposition. If you're immersed in business and you're rational, if you're immersed in technology and you're rational, you're still an embodied human. And that body still needs the experience of awe and soulfulness and caring. And one of the things I've tried to do as a management prof, to very limited success, like mostly failed at, is bring spiritual language. If you were to, please don't, but if you were to Google my reviews as a professor, you would see many students say, he's a fanatic. He comes in and he talks about all these things that have nothing to do with business, like caring and soul and spiritual, which is, it's that cliche, right? It's that cliche of thinking that business means being heartless and soulless and whatever. But yeah, many folks resist being in a space with that language because they think it has to be coming from a different space, that it's something other than what we're doing. And those same folks are not so resistant when it comes from their AI, right? AI is marvelous and wonderful, and I should worship it. But you recommending the spiritual book, you're a fanatic, you're not grounded. And I know Douglas is doing a lot of interesting stuff right now, pushing that type of language back. And I think it's on us really to be advocates for spiritual language, for spiritual tradition, to remind people that, in a non-fanatical way, there is, to use their preferred language, there is utility in these tools. It is rational to embrace these tools. There are performance outcomes from using these tools. And yes, there are fraudsters and hucksters in the spiritual world, just as there are in the other world. But to not have that language present, and it's something I continue to this day. So even though my experiments over the past 5 years have not been wholly successful, I'm not going to stop using spiritual language when I teach management. And I'm not going to stop using spiritual language when I consult for businesses, because I think it's important to use that language. And I think we desperately need, now more than ever, as traditional religions are losing their power and this new pseudo type of tech-based religion emerges, we need to be very careful to guide these folks back to what the essence of a spiritual tradition is, which is us, which is the human, and the connections we make human to human. I think what really people have to remember, I think this is if I can summarize it in one idea, okay, it's that for all its fault, when you step into a church or a synagogue or a temple or an ashram or a mosque, you're with other people. When you get on your screen and you're doing a spiritual act with your AI, you're alone. You are 100%. Even on the other side of that screen, you're alone. And it is far more likely that good things will happen when you are in a spiritual space with other human beings, whatever the tradition is, than when you're alone with your AI.
Absolutely. You remind me, and forgive me, I can't recall the name of the biologist who said this, but he described Homo sapiens as having Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And that's always stuck with me, because I agree with you. I think there is a real danger that the big tech bro leaders will be hijacking the craving that people have for a belief system and so on. But is there any place, do you think, for awe and transcendence in the way we engage with technology? Or should we just be wary of it?
The way we engage, yes, there should be awe, because awe stimulates innovation. And so, as Rorty would say, right, it's the outcome that matters. So if I pick up my AI, my phone, and I'm in awe, and I say, wow, as an outcome of this awe, I want to encourage my kids and my students to get into tech and science so they can be at the forefront of the next generation evolution in this. Beautiful. If the outcome of my awe is, I'm going to worship this and I'm going to dump my friends and I'm going to not hang out in social circles anymore and only be tied to this, then it's a problem. So I think bringing awe to tech is wonderful. Feeling, that this tech makes us feel smaller and more aware of the vastness of the world and opens our mind and heart, wonderful. But what do you do with that awe? Do you redirect that awe in something that's human-centric, or do you redirect that awe in a way that's antisocial?
What do you think a truly human-centric AI future would look like? And who needs to be in the room to shape it?
Yeah, again, this is the Nobel Prize question. I don't know. I don't know, because I'm not in the prediction game. And I'm not in the prediction game because I think anyone who is in the prediction game has been proven wrong. If you would have asked me, forget 20 years ago, if you would have asked me 5 years ago if 2025 would look like this, I would have said no. And again, the answer to who needs to be in the room, this is the cop-out answer, but it's everyone. It's everyone. We need the junior people whose jobs might be forever replaced by AI in the room. We need the senior people who have the resources and the power in the room. We need government in the room. We need religious leaders in the room. We need artists. We need engineers, and it starts to look impractical. But then we pull back and we say, but we have this great tool, right? So maybe that's what AI is. Maybe agent to agent AI should really be a way to have a scenario where you make sure everyone's agent is together, and then have these AI agents coalesce in knowledge in some way that makes them more palatable or digestible to us humans, but come back to us. I don't know. I'm not there, right? Like, I'm just thinking, can we use tech to facilitate this? Maybe, probably, hopefully. But what we need is a multiplicity of voices. And that's what's not happening right now. The tech conversation is being driven simply by a dozen men, right? Quite frankly, for better, I'm not gendering like to be clear. I'm saying I think of it in my head. Yeah, basically, it doesn't making all these decisions, and that's not great. So we need.
And I think as you're saying that, I remember the conversation we had with Douglas Rushkoff last week, and we were talking about the power of small communities, going back to a tribalism and away from the massive nation state and the massive corporation and so on. So could we speculate that actually, why don't we, in a way, use the AI tools that are being developed and actually develop our own. I mean, Douglas talks about vibe coding and so on
Yeah.
and so forth, and actually create almost like guerrilla cells and create
Yes.
our own future in the
Yes.
way that we want it to be, which is more
Yes.
human.
Yes.
What do you think about that as a possibility?
100%. I'm behind it 100%. And I think what Douglas is very good at is pushing that team human idea. And I'm behind him 100%. And, it's really important, though, that it's not just you and me and Douglas having that conversation, but we bring in our kids and our grandkids and many other folks into this as well. Because what I sometimes worry about is I sometimes worry that, okay, yeah, you and me and Doug, we're old school. So we're nostalgic for a world of spirituality and human connection and all these old timey things, right? Whereas the kids today have a better idea of things, knowing that that's not right. I don't think the kids have it right, right? But we need to bring them into the conversation too, because we're starting from the premise that you see the value in the human to human. We need to bring in the 15-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old who may not see that value, who may prefer the social isolation as a comfort, who may like to hide in social media. And we have to make sure they're part of these communities too, and they have a space and a voice in the community as we build moving forward. And so I think Douglas is well positioned to do that. I think you're well positioned to do that. There's cause for optimism that the right conversations are being had rather. The question is if they're being heard, right? The folks who dominate the platforms and are being heard are not necessarily the ones who I'd want to see leading these conversations. So, certainly on the level of the micro community, right, that's one solution. Whereas instead of saying, I need to go viral, instead, no, I need to affect the people on my street, and you need to affect the people on your street, and Doug has to affect the folks in New York on his street. That's probably the best way forward.
Yeah, it's the Robin Dunbar thing, isn't it? Communities of 150 people, which are basically a dozen families of a dozen people. That's our ancient tribal model. And it's done as well for 99.99% of our history. We touched on government a little bit, but where do you think governments are on this? And is there any government, any national government or supranational government that you think are onto
None.
this?
I am what we keep coming back to the heartbroken. So I'm sorry to be repetitive, but here's another thing that breaks my heart. The political orientation of the UK government is different than the American government, which is different than the Canadian government, right? We're on all different sides of the spectrum. What unites them is their ignorance on AI and the bad way to just hearing, I'll give you the perfect example of my environment, right? So my mayor is a hard left socialist. My premier is a right-wing conservative. And our prime minister, Mark Carney, well, let's call him a centrist, right? They're all united on the AI question. They're all mismatched. So whether left, right, center, they're handling it badly. And I don't see a model right now of a government handling it right, because one of the negative features of government is because they're so beholden to the 4-year cycle. Just as in business, they're beholden to the quarterly report. Governments are beholden to the 4-year cycle, and no one's making the tough decision that won't pay off tomorrow, but will be critical in 10, 15 years down the road. So sorry.
Yeah. Well, no. I embrace a reality check, but I would like to leave our listeners on a more positive, hopeful question. So we'll climb out of the ditch of despair, as I call it, and climb the hill of hope. So here's my last question for you, David. If you could leave our listeners with one human tool for the AI age, what would it be?
The one human tool for the AI age that I think is absolutely critical, and that is a melding of the beam idea, is to go out and be creative with other human beings. If you read my book, and I blogged about it too in Psychology Today, there's research that shows brain syncing in social setting is real. It's empirically confirmed. It's scientifically confirmed. Magic things happen to our brain. So I don't care if you're going to a concert or a gallery or a prayer session, whatever it is, get together with other folks, be creative in that environment. Creative could mean sing with your prayer group, could mean paint with a group of folks, could be clap along and dance with a concert. Go and do that as the secret to thriving in the AI age, because you will come out of that changed. Your brain will be better positioned to deal with the AI. Your body will be better positioned to deal with the strings of the algorithm. So, that tool, use your body in a creative environment to engage in creative action with like-minded individuals. Do that and you'll be stronger. And why do I get hope? Why does that make me so hopeful? That's so easy. Anyone can do that. Anyone can find a space with another individual and just be a person.
And what I would say, David, yes, hallelujah to that. I would also say that we only met 50 minutes ago, and I think our brains already got in sync over the course of this conversation. So there's the proof point. And I hope that our listeners are also finding their minds, their brains going in sync. So thank you, David. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the thought-provoking insights you shared with us, and also the humility that you shared, which, when you said, well, I don't know. And, as philosophers, I guess we just have to focus on the right questions.
Yeah.
And thank you also to our listeners for joining us. Please share any feedback. And if you enjoyed ChatRog, like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and colleagues. Join us next time as we continue to question not just what AI can do, but what it should do.